As you guys know, I love streetwear and I also love workwear, and the fusion of these two basically makes the foundation of my style. And a big part of this are workwear jackets. I love them and they're a huge staple in my wardrobe which combines these two styles together. And the best thing about workwear jackets is that they're so easy to come by. You can buy them new or thrift them. But for me personally, I really like the older versions of the Detroit jacket. And this is where this jacket comes in. It's the J001 Detroit jacket in black. I found it online in such pristine condition at such a low price that I just couldn't say no. But unfortunately, sometimes these jackets come with embroidery. So team, in this video, I'm going to show you how I remove embroidery on a budget. And at any point that you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please do leave a like since it does help the channel to grow, and let's just get started. To start off, you'll need one of these tools called a seam ripper. They're really cheap and can be picked up from your local supermarket for around $5. I also like to use a pair of mini scissors and or a fabric shaver to clear the excess thread, but use the fabric shaver sparingly though. I'll show you why later in the video. Before I start removing the embroidery, I like to inspect the stitching before I begin. This can really make the process of removing it easier. One thing that I did dismiss though, which I shouldn't have, was the fact that there are two layers to the stitching. There is stitching for the lettering and there's stitching for the black outline, which I didn't see first time around. I would have gone about removing the stitching for this differently if I noticed this from the beginning. The outlining made removing the stitching a lot harder than expected, especially because it was black thread against black fabric. So consider this if you're thinking about removing embroidery. Always seam rip from the inside, because if you make a mistake, at least it happens somewhere where it's not visible. But sometimes you can be forced to rip some seams from the outside, so be extra careful when this does happen. I always like to start ripping seams where it looks the easiest. This is where stitching isn't so tightly knit. The first time I removed the embroidery, I thought the smaller areas would be the easiest, but it's actually the complete opposite, because those areas are the hardest to rip and the easiest to leave marked, so take extra care with them. And despite how tempting it is to rip a bunch of seams in one go, I recommend to only rip maybe up to 4 threads at a time, because the less threads there are to break, the less force you need to use. And the more force you need to use, the more likely the thread hole will widen and leave a weird mark on the fabric. The best case scenario is when you're pulling the thread and it comes loose without you ripping it. This is the best way to prevent leaving a mark. Anyways, this was the progress after removing my first letter and I was quite happy of how it was going. But as I was removing more of the embroidery, I was finding it more difficult because I was removing both layers at the same time. This caused the threads to knot and made it very hard to see where the next thread I should rip is. Also, the blanket lining of the jacket didn't make it any easier since it did fray a lot. You may not run into this issue if the lining of your jacket is different. Even though I trimmed the excess thread, it was still difficult to see since this embroidery was the highest quality that I've ever tried to remove. The stitching was so precise, well done and tightly packed. So if the embroidery looks really high quality, do expect some difficulty in removing it. You can generally tell how tight the embroidery is by how flat it is against the fabric. Unfortunately, it was only now that I realized that I should have removed the embroidery layer by layer. So I removed the black outlining before I removed the green lettering, and it made the process a lot cleaner and a lot easier. But if I had to do this all over again, I would remove all the outlining for the whole stitching before removing the lettering. I think this method would have produced the best results. There is no trick to distinguishing the black embroidery from the black canvas other than the stitching seeming a little shinier, but it still confused me a lot of the time. I would avoid buying a piece with embroidery that matches the color of the fabric if you're planning on removing it, because it can be very difficult. It took a few hours of patience, determination and a pair of sore hands to remove the embroidery. Usually it isn't this difficult, but because of how well the embroidery was sewn and the black thread on black canvas, it was extremely less straightforward. So this is what it looks like after all the embroidery was removed. You can see that it left a few marks. At the beginning of the video, I said that if you were to use a fabric shaver, you should use it sparingly. This is because I went a bit overboard and shaved a lot off the blanket lining, which made a hole. And of course I couldn't leave it like that, so I cut a piece of fabric with a similar thickness and patched it up. Hopefully this will prevent the hole from getting any worse, and in a way it adds a nice personal touch. Once that was done, I moved as much excess thread that I could see and then threw it in for a cold wash in hopes that it evens out the fabric. Once dried, this was the result. It's definitely not my most perfect work, but considering how well the embroidery was stitched, I think I did my best to minimize damage with the knowledge I had at the time. I would have definitely approached this differently if I did it again. As you can see, there are some minor marks on the fabric because of how tightly packed the embroidery was. I did use a pen to colour in the fabric to make it less noticeable, but I wouldn't really call it an eyesore. Overall, I think it was a success. It could have gone better, but I'm quite happy with the results regardless. When I wear the jacket, you can barely notice the marks, and it's still a really nice jacket. So if you have any questions, let me know in the comment section below. I hope that you were able to learn something from this video and my experience, and if you did, please do consider subscribing. And as always, thanks for watching. Peace.